Hello, and welcome to the Sustainability Leaders Podcast, part of the Jobs with Impact compendium of resources for people who want to make a positive impact on the world. I'm David Rosenheim, your host. Every episode, we bring you in-depth conversations with people who are leading the way to a sustainable future. I hope these conversations will be as inspiring to you as they are to me. And most of all, I hope that they'll empower you to take action. The planet needs you. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to jobswithimpact.com. Please help us to spread the word by taking a minute to rate and review the show in iTunes and by telling your friends and colleagues. Hi folks, welcome to episode 25. Before we jump into this episode with Mike Casey, I wanted to let you know that we're taking a summer break from the podcast and will return with a new season in September. Have a great summer, and be sure to check out some of our back episodes that you may not have yet heard. This week, we're featuring my interview with Mike Casey, CEO of Tigercomm and an expert in communicating climate change, or as he puts it, global climate disruption. Mike has deep expertise in communications, from his early days with Bill Clinton's comms team to advising Tom Steyer in challenging the Keystone XL pipeline, to his current work in helping renewable energy developers across the country clear the hurdles they often face in getting big projects through. Mike is thoughtful, clear-sighted, and emphatic about our race to save the planet. Great. Well, Mike Casey, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to start with your background, your childhood. And I understand that you grew up in West Cleveland. Tell me what your neighborhood was like and what your childhood was all about.
So I grew up on the west side of Cleveland in a big Irish Catholic neighborhood. It was a suburb of Cleveland, but it was very much, I think, second, third generation Irish immigrants, and they collected money for the IRA in my neighborhood, so it was very identified, if you will. And my folks were both teachers, so I grew up. It was a nice, safe place to grow up. And it's now become the 50-yard line of American politics. Like, literally, if you win my precinct, you can win my county. If you win my county by a significant margin, you will take the whole state of Ohio.
Wow.
So,
and were politics part of your realm growing up?
Not at all. Just not at all.
And what was your sense of the natural world?
When I read The 20th Day by Lester Brown, who was running the World Watch Institute at the time, it was such a alarm bell for me. And I can't tell you why, but it was just so profound that I remember opening the window of my dorm room and breathing the winter air, and I wanted to just scream, stop. We got to stop what we're doing here because we're treating the world like a toilet. We're living off the principle instead of the interest on our natural resource bank account. And to me, that was just fundamentally stupid. And I decided then to devote my life in some way to addressing this problem in whatever way I could contribute. So that set the course, basically.
That's a pretty young age to have that that degree of consciousness. I want to just, before we leave your childhood, though, just want to touch on your dad's experience. He was one of the few Marines that were left standing at Iwo Jima. And I understand that you, many years later, had the experience of standing on that beach.
Yeah.
What was that like? And I wonder also, did your dad talk about that experience?
Yeah, so he was according to the Marine Corps historian, my father was one of a few dozen, maybe 100 Marines who survived the battles of Iwo Jima and the Chosin Reservoir. There were, I think, 80,000 Marines involved in the Battle of Iwo Jima, and 26,000 were lost. So 60,000 came off that island. But if you subset that down, who made it to the Chosin Reservoir and then made it out, who had also served there was quite small. And I did a military historical tour to the island of Iwo Jima for the 65th anniversary of the battle. Invited him to go. He said, I hate that place. I never want to see it again, but I want you to go. So I went there, and I had the fortune of meeting this man who was I think still is, the historian of the Marine Corps, at a ceremony at Quantico a week before I left to go to Iwo Jima. And we asked him, do you know, here's my father's unit, do you know where they landed? Because he was giving all sorts of these details, and he actually did. He opened up a map. He said, yep, your dad landed right there. I took a picture. And so when we went to the island of Iwo Jima, you went up to Mount Suribachi, I think that's how it's pronounced, and looked down, and I could see the little cove. And I then walked down the beach, and I just stood there for a long time. And I at some point I just sat down and just bawled, because you really got the sense when you're there how much was lost by everybody who was involved. But my father was a very withheld man. He didn't drink. He wasn't violent. He taught school for almost 60 years. And in retrospect, I can see that in part what he was doing was keeping his demons at bay from us. And when you're walking on the beach, you can see there's all sorts of pieces of metal left over from the battle. The island's 50 feet higher now than it was at that time because it's volcanic and it's basically swelling up. But I found a shell casing, which could have come from his rifle. And I went into a pillbox, which had a clear line of fire onto the beach that he landed on with a Nambu machine gun, which could have been firing at him. And so it was just a really profound experience, definitely a trip of a lifetime. And I brought some sand back for him and gave it to him, and he was very grateful for that. So I still have that at home. But when times get tough in my line of work, I just say, well, wait a second, my dad was 17 when he did this. 17. That's a year older than my daughter. He got permission slip from his mother, and he enlisted, and he actually had done Tiananmen and Saipan, and then he went to Iwo Jima. So he was 17 when he went on to that island, and he actually turned 18 on the island during the battle. So that has been part of my upbringing in very big ways that I didn't get until that time. And then I read David Halberstam's book about the Korean War, and when you read about the Chosun Reservoir and the horror of it, I got my dad in a way that I never had before. So you can just tell, like, he was 17, 18 in World War II, early to mid 20s in Korea. So as a 25-year-old man, you're literally stacking grotesquely disfigured frozen bodies of your comrades onto trucks. And then you're fighting your way out through what's really the equivalent of West Virginia topography. And it's just, it's brutal. So when times get tough, I think I have first world problems. I have my problems are inconveniences.
And it's interesting to think about the paradigm in which your dad and people living during that war lived, and how it must have seemed, to be, and it was all encompassing, certainly if you're in it. And I'm thinking now about those of us that are working on climate change, and we see this as being, sort of the battle of a lifetime, of a generation, the kind of all-encompassing problem. But it's good to remember that I think historically people have found themselves in lots of different all-encompassing kind of unsurmountable situations.
Yeah, I've been fascinated by tales of extraordinary human endeavor my whole life. I remember reading a Washington Post story about this guy in Iraq during Saddam Hussein, and he knew that the police were going to come get him the next day. He was a carpenter. And so he built a false wall in his house, in a room in his house, and he built a trap door underneath the bed to get into the compartment formed by the false wall. And he crawled in. And there he stayed for 19 years. 19 years. Only his mother knew where he was. The police came repeatedly to the house looking for him, couldn't find him. And he watched his sister get married through a little crack in the wall of his house out in the yard of their compound. And I thought, what an extraordinary story. I mean, just it's an amazing thing to have done. And I also remember a story about a pair of British climbers. I think this is on cable television later, but basically these two guys go to the Andes, they summit, they start coming down, and the one guy falls into a crevasse, like 40 foot down, shatters his leg. And his other friend thinks he's dead and doesn't have any way of getting him. So this friend very reluctantly leaves him. And this guy wakes up and somehow, with a shattered leg and an ice pick, pulls himself up out of a 40-foot crevasse, surfaces, and it's night, and it's plunging to 80 degrees below zero, whatever. The guy's hypothermic, he's dehydrated, he's starving, and he, on a shattered leg with a 2.5, 3 foot ice pick as a crutch, walks down the mountain for 3 days. And when he cannot go anymore, he collapses, passes out, then wakes up and decides to take the next 20 steps. So he shrunk his perspective down to 20 steps. And he got down. And how I know he got down was he collapsed one last time, fell, and was almost overcome by a horrible smell, and realized that he'd fallen into the latrine ditch of his friend and the porters who had been burning his stuff as a memorial to him. And they found him. He croaked out a word. They pulled him out, cleaned him up, and got him down. So the guy's got God knows how many inches off his body from frostbite and whatever, but he survived. So, and you just go on and on and on. Men and women of all walks of life have done these extraordinary things. And I think the lesson I've drawn from that relative to global climate disruption are several. First, I don't think we have an environmental crisis. I think we have a crisis of consciousness. If people were awake to the present moment, which you must be in a very profound way to survive things like my dad did, like that guy in Iraq did, like the climbers, the British climbers, you have to be focused on the next 20 steps, your next step or your next 20 steps. And it's those little things that add up to big things, at times, great things. And that requires a presence. Surely, if we were awake and to the present moment in our daily lives, we would not be treating this world like a toilet.
And where do you see – so this is a really interesting topic to me, and I know that you're a practitioner, a very accomplished practitioner of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and I think other martial arts, and I know that you meditate, and as do I. And it's interesting to frame this crisis as a crisis of consciousness. If that's the case, where are we evolutionarily in terms of the development of human consciousness? Is this something that is improving? Are we, there's certainly a lot of people meditating these days. That's, maybe that's a fad. Maybe it's not.
I hope not.
Is this, because I think about this and I think, well, when I'm thinking optimistically, maybe this is the necessary next step in our evolution is actually, just as you're saying, it's an evolution in consciousness. And maybe global climate disruption, and I want to talk to you about that term as well, is just a giant and actually beneficial feedback that our collective natural system is giving us so that we wake the fuck up.
So I think, and I came to this perspective, I'm 54 now. When I was 50, I celebrate my birthday. I went spend a week with 520 of my best friends at an Eckhart Tolle seminar. And I follow Eckhart Tolle. I like him a lot. I listen to his recordings almost every day. And I listened to that, and then I went to Mexico surfing for 2 weeks. Was one of the longest breaks I'd taken from work in a long time. And that's where I came to this realization. We have a crisis in awareness, not a crisis of we don't have an environmental crisis much as we have a spiritual crisis. So going back to your question, how are we trending? I think we're careening toward disaster at a increasing speed, and I'm not clear that our consciousness is picking up at a commensurate rate. I think we're winging it. I really do. I think we're winging it, and I think we're winging it in a way that our lack of awareness does not see how dire it is. Here's the challenge with keeping your sanity while you do this work. If you are paying attention to planetary trends, you will go crazy, I think, unless you have some remediation strategy in your personal life. You think about this. We're at the stage now where we've got more plastic in the ocean than plankton. Think about that for a second. We have 85,000 chemicals permitted for use in the United States of American consumer products, not food and drugs, but the products. And we know much about 12 or 15 of them that we banned. We deliberately let chemical lobbyists set up a Russian roulette system where we'll permit the chemical for use, and if it goes out in the world and creates havoc, we'll study that, and then maybe we'll pull it off the shelves in a decades-long process. That's insane. That's insane. And only a damn fool would permit that system, or somebody who's asleep. So I don't know if the very pronounced feedback that we're getting now, which, by the way, is going to escalate in very unpleasant ways, I don't think it's inherently good. I'm not sure we're aware enough to get the benefit from it. But I sure as hell know that there is no greater issue that humanity has ever faced than this, because we're looking at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you look at the hierarchy of needs, we're chipping away at our ability to address our most basic needs, and which you can survive 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food, rough numbers. But if you're removing your ability to get clean air and clean water, it's pretty basic. And so that to me, I think, is the real issue. And I've had to find mitigation strategies or mitigation practices in my life to not go crazy looking around
down the rabbit hole.
Oh my God, the abject ignorance. I was talking to a senior executive at a clean economy company not 2 weeks ago, recently joined the company, and said to me point blank, yeah, sustainability is really not really much of a motivator for me. I just don't care about it much. And I thought to myself, didn't say, don't worry, you will soon, because everybody will. But by the time he and definitely the people lost in Trump think, when those people wake up to our situation, it'll be too late. It's perhaps too late to stave off the most tolerable parts of global climate disruption. It may be too late to stave off the worst of it. Like, we may be locked into Mad Max at Thunderdome. I just don't know. I don't think anybody knows. But I know that Confucius said, better to light one candle than to curse the darkness. And I think that's, if you're concerned climatologically, that's the best place to go is, yeah, water's coming in the boat. There's no other boat around. There's no other boats on the horizon. But you can whine or you can bail. What do you want to do? Those are your choices, whine or bail. Or pretend that your feet aren't getting wet. Those are, you have three choices. You can pretend, you can whine, or you can bail. I prefer to bail.
So I want to just come back to your awakening, your freshman year of college, and try to get an understanding of how you saw that path at that time.
I can answer that. So here's basically the journey. I read this book. I started thinking about what can I do. The next year, I began to stitch together at least a focus area, which was I thought, I'm going to try to focus on the intersection of politics and media because I'm drawn to those two things, policy, politics, and media. And I took a course called Campaigns and Elections taught by a guy named Herb Asher. He might still be alive, but he was a pretty well-known analyst. It's kind of like the Larry Sabato of Ohio. And I got assigned a campaign for this guy named Michael Schwartzwalder. He was a state senator in the Ohio State Senate. He was a Democrat. And unbeknownst to any of us working on his reelection campaign, he was targeted by a guy named Lee Atwater, who at the time was just the political director of the RNC, went on to much greater fame and fortune before he died of brain cancer. And Atwater was an evil genius. And he targeted Schwartzwalder for defeat because it was part of a redistricting plan, because Republicans have typically played the long ball better than Democrats, in my experience. And they targeted Schwartzwalder with a Willie Horton-style ad. He had been called – he had been subpoenaed as defense witness to testify on behalf of a Ohio State psychology professor Schwartzwalder had gone to school with at the time. And the professor was African-American, and it was alleged that he had raped a white woman. And so Atwater ran this ad against Schwartzwalder, which was a race-baiting ad, basically playing on the fears that this black psychologist had taken advantage of a white patient. And Schwartzwalder lost. It was 1984, it was the Reagan wave. And I remember very clearly we were in this little motel at the election party, which was going to end up being a concession party. And people who knew Schwartzwalder were crying because he'd really been a trooper. He had put in the first anti-fat discrimination bill, I think, in the country, into the Ohio Senate. He was really an innovative guy. And he was beaten by this guy named Gene Watts, who was, a kind of a Reagan convert. And there was something about the whole thing that just pissed me off. And I said, you know what? Two can play this game. If you're going to be rough and tumble, I'll be more rough and tumble. And mind you, when I was growing up, I got picked on a lot. I got bullied in school, and I was nobody's idea of a pugilist, and I wasn't a tough guy. But it was something in that moment where I said, okay, I'm going to take my skill set, and if you're going to, for partisan reasons, ideological reasons, or for lobbying interests, you're going to try to wreck the future of the planet I'm going to live on, you're going to have to come through me, and I'm going to make my mind into a weapon. And my mind and my voice into a weapon, and I will be as effective as I can possibly be. So I devoted myself that kind of forged my career path. I was going to go into politics, and I was going to go to rough and tumble campaigns. So I ended up doing 2 presidentials. I was the comms director for the DCCC in 1994.
So this was Dukakis in Ohio and then Clinton 92 in Michigan?
Clinton Gore in 92. And my job for Clinton Gore was to basically run Republicans for Clinton Gore. And every time – and then I also ran the disruption protests that covertly went into every George Bush appearance in the state of Michigan. And there were many because he had to win the state. And our job is to get as close to him as possible, put up signs and call him a liar because of his no new taxes pledge, and to bait him into getting off message. And there was all the things you might expect. There was pushing and shoving and fisticuffs and all this stuff. But our job was to get him off message, and we did a number of times. We ran Republicans for Clinton Gore around the state of Michigan, and it was very formative. And it occurred to me along this way that that media was becoming the most important thing in this world. It was more important than the law because it shaped the environment in which laws were administered and upheld or not and formed in the first place. And I thought, media, okay, I got some abilities here. They're not extraordinary, but there's some. But I have an extraordinary amount of concern about this subject area, so I'll marry an extraordinary concern, like a heightened commitment, to, let's say, above average talents, and let's see how far we can go. And there I've devoted myself to the last 34 years. Right.
So just curious, during those early campaigns, the Dukakis and Clinton campaigns, what were the key environmental issues, or were environmental issues even really part of the platforms?
Not really. They were, until Clinton, Gore is running against Bush, and Bush is taunting Gore as ozone man. They really weren't. They were a motivator for me. They weren't part of the political dialogue. And I think until this year, they haven't been much of a dialogue point at all. You know, they've been a liability. And the greatest issue that I found in Democratic and progressive politics was what I call principal loserism. It's a term I've coined. And it's an infectious disease that pervades blue and green circles. It's a lot of magical thinking. It's a lot of denial of reality. It's a wish that politics were not a full contact sport, that a lot of capitalism and disruption in capitalism is actually a zero-sum game. And there's a wish, particularly of denizens of very blue progressive cities, that the rest of the country where I come from and where I live is not the way that it is. And, you know, there's a Zen koan that says you can stand in the circle of what is, or you can stand in the circle of what should be and shout at the circle of what is. I prefer to do the former. And that's kind of where effectiveness happens, in my view. And it's, I think, one of the things that really wore me out about politics, from which I retired 4 years ago, was just I got tired of principal loserism running rampant in leadership circles and in funding circles. It was just a lot of folks who they really need to go door to door in where I grew up to really get the realities of how Americans think, and they don't.
So in the intervening years, intervening meaning sort of before the last, 5 or 10 years, you were involved in a couple environmental groups, the National Environmental Trust, which then became part of the Pew Environmental Group, and also the Environmental Working Group.
Yeah.
So what were some of the big elements of the platform or the issues that you're working on, and kind of what did you learn then about communicating environmental issues that you carry with you today?
So I forgive me, I'm jumping around a lot, so I'll try to be more sequential here.
We don't have to be sequential, by the way. But
Thank you. In my time in politics, what I saw was that Democrats and progressives bring plastic forks to knife fights, as David Roberts writes. He's one of my favorite reporters. I just love his stuff. And I call it principal loserism, and it really irritated me. But when I was at the DCCC and Clinton was in the White House, and we got that ass kicking in '94, I said, well, hey, look, you've spent over a decade in politics working to put people into office or out of office and serving them once they're in office. Now it's time to put your career where your mouth is. You say you're committed to sustainability, better do it, because what's left to do? Well, you can go into the administration. You can try to be the comms director of the DNC, or I interviewed for deputy press secretary for the White House under D.D. Myers, and I just said, look, it's call time, right? Cards down, let's go. And so I went interviewing in the environmental community. What you realized is your average National Environmental Group's communications director doesn't have any experience, no professional experience, at least at the time, did not have professional experience with the realities of politics, had never drawn a check putting somebody into office or taking them out of office or working for them once they're in office. there's a lot of former reporters, which past 5 years in reporting, news reporting, you're habituated to such an extent in ways of thinking that you are going to be almost for certain limited in your effectiveness as an institutional communicator. I can go into that some other point, but there was just a lot of principal loserism that pervaded the ranks of institutional communicators on behalf of the national environmental groups. And I met this guy named Phil Clapp, who was controversial. He was mercurial, not an easy man to work for, but he was brilliant. And he had been funded by a guy named Josh Reichert to start an environmental war room that was going to, like it or not, address the weaknesses of environmental campaigning. And Phil was very aggressive. And he had super sharp elbows, but I learned a ton from him. And we went on a streak and we beat the Gingrich Revolution 21 different times, 21 different issue campaigns ranging from endangered species to regulatory rollbacks to Safe Drinking Water Act amendments. And I learned a lot from him. It's just a lot of constant pressure. And I then went to work for Ken Cook at Environmental Working Group, which he still runs. And Ken, I learned even more from. So I worked for Phil for 4 years, and I worked for Ken for 8 years. And Ken was really ahead of his time in a lot of ways. He's a brilliant writer. I think the thing I most learned from him was the idea that you can create narrative out of the way you pursue information, not just in the information you get. He understood in very intuitive ways the value of framing. And at the time, the other SVP for the group, Richard Wiles, is a dear friend of mine. He was in Brazil. His wife was working for, I think, NASA on a special project down in Brazil. So I came to the organization, and Ken essentially let me basically revamp the whole organization's management structure. So before the internet came, communications got old by like year 5 or 7 because you'd written your 100th news release. You'd made your 5,000th pitch call. You'd sent your 10,000th fax through a fax machine. And it just got old. And so that's why a lot of people left. They went on to become executive directors or political directors, or they ran for office themselves, or they went off into corporate communications. And so the natural place to go to keep challenging yourself was, how do you make communication shops better? And so I devoted myself to learning how to manage, because I think naturally I stunk at management. It just had a lot of young person's mistakes and a lot of young person's arrogance, and I had to really give that up in ways I didn't expect. So
how did you learn that that you had to make those changes? What gave you sort of the insight or the self-awareness?
That's a good question. Wow. I think at the time those 12 years I spent in the environmental community, I was also doing a lot of self-development programs. I've done the Forum. I've done Sterling Men's Weekend. I did Outward Bound, and I'm an Outward Bound graduate from high school. But I was also on this path of exploration, self-development, self-discovery. And along the way, what it all comes back to is just being more aware of you and how you are out in the world. And I think the cumulative effect of being a daily meditator helps you realize the way you're affecting other people in your surroundings. And I think...
Were you meditating back then?
Yeah. I've been meditating daily for 20 years, and I've been meditating on and off since 7th grade. Yeah. When 7th grade, a bunch of my friends, we were watching Kung Fu episodes. We thought David Carradine's character was super cool. And on a dare, we all went to a yoga class, beginner's yoga class, and I was the only one who showed up. The rest of those bums didn't go. And this yoga teacher taught me to meditate the first time, and it was one of those really formative experiences. It was really amazing. And I struggled with consistency in meditation from 7th grade to, my mid-30s, and that's when I really hit stride. But as you grow in the meditation practice, you become aware of how you're coming across to other people, and you just start putting 2 and 2 together and realize, look, when I'm a jerk, when I raise my voice, when I'm not clear in what I'm asking of people who report up to me, you don't get as much out of them. Plus, it's not fun. It's being an effective manager is much more rewarding than being a crummy manager. And I think after really focusing on it, I'm a pretty good manager. I don't think I'm a great manager. I think being a great manager for me and with my limitations is going to be a lifetime pursuit. But good news is, it's kind of like jiu-jitsu. You can never master it, so you just lean in for the rest of your life, and it's a lifetime pursuit. So I'm kind of I'm a lifetime student of being a better manager.
So at this point in your career, you're involved in restructuring an organization that is kind of front and center in communicating environmental issues. What is the career path for people who, care deeply about this issue and are interested in the communication side of it?
At this point now, as we're talking?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's more – the good news is that there's much more in the way of opportunity now than there was when I was hacking this out on my own. And I know that in lots of ways, but I'll tell you the one that perhaps is the leading indicator for me. I now have people who come to me who want to work in my firm who understand and aspire to be a sustainability communicator. When I started the firm 13 years ago, I had to talk people who were generally amenable to the idea into it and explain it to them and enroll them. Now I've got people, and they're not just all young, who say, I'm really concerned about planetary direction. I want to be a communicator on these issues. Can I come work here? What advice do you have for me? So that's the growth of interest is, in my mind, an indicator that there's more opportunity, because if there weren't opportunity, it'd be discouraging people. The bad news is that I think we're doing a terrible job of communicating, of training job hunters to think about developing your skills in an intentional way. And I'm particularly concerned. I've been frustrated for a long time about what I perceive just from my I'm a small employer, but I'm not satisfied that we are talking to students of color about this as a career path. We're not going out recruiting available talent. I don't think we've done a good job figuring out how do we tap the talent of this ocean of smart, professionally accomplished people, mostly women, some men, who dropped out of the workforce or reduced their role significantly because they had a parent. And if we're going to solve this existential threat to human civilization, we need all the oars in the water pulling in the same direction. We need really smart communicators, and we don't have an overabundance of them. There's some. We need more. We need more people who are really committed and want to dig on this thing, because it's a terrible problem that will affect 100% of humanity in extremely bad ways. And we just aren't bringing enough talent to bear, in my opinion. And I'm not in a place where I know the curriculum of American higher education collectively on these issues, but just looking at the talent pool, I don't think we're teaching young people how to pitch themselves for jobs. And I don't think we're talking to young people in general, but particularly students of color. We're not presenting them, hey, you can succeed here. And it irritates me because it limits the talent pool that I have access to as a small employer.
Well, I mean, the environmental movement, the sort of traditional environmental movement has been white and has been male. Yeah. I think only recently we're starting to see this interesting collaboration that's emerging around issues of equity, and more people are coming into the discussion, necessarily.
Yeah, and I think that our lack of dialogue with young people is in large part it's a symptom of our challenge that we fail to communicate these issues in important ways. Like if I could stand up on a stage and talk to the entire U.S. Body politic that's concerned about these issues, the first thing I would say is, do not use the words greenhouse gas emissions. Don't ever do that again. Why? Because if I could go back in time 30 years when we were at the dawn of talking about these issues, and I was there, we should never have called it global warming. We should have called it global climate disruption. Why? Because we can then we can own the cold stuff. We can own the rainy stuff. Jim Inhofe doesn't get to throw snowballs on the Senate floor and make fun of us. It was a stupid thing to do, and the term greenhouse gas emissions is a dumb shit term. It's stupid. It doesn't communicate. It tests poorly. It tested poorly 25 years ago.
It's too technical.
Yeah, hell yeah. Emissions is like facility. A facility can be anything from a toilet to a factory. It's a stupid word choice. I'm on this listserv. I won't say what it is because you're supposed to keep it confidential. But there was conversation a couple of years ago, and I'd signed off in a frustration because these well-meaning environmentalists were talking about we're going to start this campaign called Extreme Energy, and I was on there politely trying to say that's not a good term. And they were trying to come up with a term for what I call junk energy. Well, we've gotten most of the easy stuff out of the ground. Now we're having to take toxic chemicals, pierce aquifers to get at shale gas deposits, shale oil deposits. We're blowing the tops off mountains to get at coal seams that 100 years ago we were more easily getting by digging holes in the ground. You know what I mean? Like, so we're going after the coal to liquid, all this insane stuff. You call it extreme energy. It's an understandable creative flair, but it's also stupid. Why? If you and I walk to your nearest 7-Eleven and we walk down the aisle, what are we going to see? Extreme energy drink, extreme snacks, extreme is not, those who have marketing budgets have found this term is actually a good thing to use. It taps into a positive value for consumers. Why the hell are you going to use that term to describe something that's terrible? Use a terrible term to describe something that's terrible. Call it junk energy. No one likes junk. And it's immensely frustrating to me. So I have a saying in our firm called ABF, always be framing. Always be framing. And we actually went to the extent of taking the still shot from Alec Baldwin's Glenn Ross, very famous, always be closing. And we took a still shot and we changed out, my colleague Sarah Lippincott took out the C and converted to an F, and we put it always be framing. And we use that for client training materials. The environmental community, the climate hawk community, needs to always be framing. Well, there's one I had minimal involvement. I had 1 year worth of involvement in. But if you want to see really good framing, check out the path from the LGBT community. 2004, same-sex marriage equality was a political negative, such that George Bush ran on it. In 2012, Barack Obama ran for re-election being for marriage equality. So homosexual marriage went to marriage equality. And you cannot do anything but praise the group of people, whoever they are, that figured out how to frame their experience in a way that the rest of America could understand.
So I've seen this evolution. When I first started working full-time in this space, 2010, you really couldn't talk about climate change. Like, it was verboten. We had to kind of dress it up and talk about, efficiency and cost savings and paint it in sort of beneficial financial terms. And then that started to change and we could talk about climate change, but we had to do it from kind of a sense of we were warned not to freak people out. Doom and gloom would quickly, turn them off, especially men, and a lot of work at Yale and other places sort of looked at sort of the degree of optimism versus pessimism that you could use in communicating it. More recently, we've seen, particularly in Europe, with the student protests subsequent to the most recent IPCC report, that really shows the serious shit that we're in. Yeah, that we're saying, screw, candy coating this. Like, wake up. We have to take this really seriously. Yeah. This is as you were saying, this is the bottom of Maslow's pyramid. This is an existential threat. Okay, so that has sort of been, some of the arc, at least in the States, of the ways in which we either communicate or are afraid to communicate this. How should we be approaching this in terms of the urgency versus optimism?
That's a really hard call. So I think Anthony Ed at the Yale Center for Climate Communications, I'm a fan of theirs. I think they do super important work. And I think their psychographic divisions, I think it's the 9 Americas, the 7 Americas, I can't remember what it is, but it's very smart. I'm actually meeting up with Ed. He works out at George Mason, so it's close to my house. I'm seeing him a couple of weeks from now. I think that they're doing really important concerted work. But let me go back to your question. In my judgment, we have a big gap right now between the energy of the Sunrise Movement and the Green New Deal, and the way we need to communicate to the peelable parts of the Trump voting world, or independents, Republican-leaning independents. And the reason we have such a big gap is because we've had 25 years of abject failure to adapt our climate communications to opinion realities in the United States. We've insisted on being right instead of effective, and it's dumb. And now the situation's gotten so bad that you're cleaving a good part of America off into denial land, and you have a growing movement of young people, primarily, who are an awakened cohort who get just how terribly threatening this is. And the gap is big because we didn't manage the gap early on when it was smaller. Shame on communicators of my age. That was our fault. So then I think, to your point, how much of the dire nature of our straits do you use in the framing and the word choice and the communicating? I think the jury is out. But there are some basic things that we should start doing now. For example, it was immensely frustrating to me in the late 2000s. The fossil fuel lobby geared up what remains, I think, the greatest surge in propaganda and influence peddling that the United States of America has ever seen in the history of this republic.
Well, maybe the tobacco lobby could rival that, but yeah.
No, bigger, much bigger. Okay. So question, at the height of the fight over the climate bill in 2009, how many expensive, national prominent, major lobbying firms did ExxonMobil have on retainer? How many?
I have no idea.
24. And the retainer rates for these guys are easily 75 to 100 grand a month. So in 2005, the talk when I began Tigercomm, clean tech circles, much smaller then, and climate circles, a little bit smaller then, were certain that we would have a global carbon pollution treaty, and we would have a price on carbon pollution in effect in the United States. And these were two existential threats that the fossil fuel lobby solved for by ramping up its spending on propaganda influence peddling. It built an entire echo chamber. We have a deck that is a diagnosis deck we did back then. It's kind of the inconvenient truth for clean techers. I'll show it to you sometime. We call it the widening chasm, and it basically unpacks the growth of the fossil fuel lobby's echo chamber. And it's perhaps, without intending to, it was a precursor to and functions as kind of an extension on Naomi Oreskes' book,
Naomi Klein's book? Or?
Naomi Oreskes' book, Merchants of Doubt. So Merchants of Doubt is a really helpful family tree evolutionary explanation of the front group industry. It imbues those guys with too much ideological motivation when really it's just mercenary. And those guys are conservative. They are quote unquote free market libertarians, except when they're not, and when they want handouts from the government. But anyway, we unpack this thing, and we let the fossil fuel lobby engineer the subsidy conversation entirely down at our end zone, when in fact the fossil fuel lobby is subsidized, underwritten by taxpayers at 100 to 200 times as much as climate solutions technologies ever have been. So let's think about the paradox. Climate solutions technologies have a very limited amount of public support. That public support is wildly popular with Americans. They want these technologies grown because they get that they grow jobs. You don't have to be a climate hawk to like them or support them because they create jobs in your community. We let the fossil fuel lobby spend the entire conversation of whether or not it was, quote, time to stand on our own 2 feet. Let's step back for a second. How long have we been burning coal as a global society?
200 years?
Yeah, 250 years. Those clowns have been on welfare, public welfare of one form or another, for 200 years. So why in the hell have we not been talking about corporate welfare for fossil fuel companies? And we still don't. And at a conference I was talking at, I was on a panel with a guy who did a lot of polling for the oil industry. And he said every time Obama talks about subsidies for oil companies, our numbers take a 10 or 11 point hit. The oil companies are freaked out about it. But, no one pushed Obama to talk about it on a consistent basis. If I were Obama, I would have talked about it the whole way through. Because then we get to carjack what George Lakoff talks about, this strong father paradigm of conservative politics. There's a saying that libertarians like, if you want a helping hand, look at the end of your arm. Great. You want to have a conversation about cost? Bring it. Let's do it. Because you know what? You're underwritten 7 different ways. You get tax credits. You get tax deductions. We have whole branches of the government that are devoted to making your life easier, to performing private sector functions. You want to tell me why I have an overseas petroleum insurance corporation? Why on earth is there a Department of Energy fossil fuel office?
Right.
We actually asked those guys for our blog, what do you do? What have you done? And their brag points are, we underwrote the invention of fracking. Step back and think about that. Why in the hell did the natural gas industry not have to invent fracking on its own? Why did my money go to invent a technology that fails catastrophically? Because what we know from documents that have fallen off the back of the truck, literally fallen off the back of the truck from the natural gas industry, is that 1/3 of well casings will fail. They will leak toxic chemicals into the aquifers they must necessarily pierce to get at shale gas and shale oil formations. Because we did a map. For the blog, we did a map that looked at geologically where are the aquifers and where are the shale gas deposits. And I'm not a geologist, I don't know why, but there's a very, very heavy overlap. And the deposits are below the aquifers, so you're having to pierce the aquifers to get at the frack gas deposits. So that means that point number 2, right? We're not talking about oil companies as welfare bums, and they are. We're not talking about coal companies as welfare bums, and they are. We're not using the term welfare bums because somehow that carries a negative connotation. The hell with that. I want to take that term and apply it where it really should be.
And of course, we're not talking at all about the externalities, the real costs. And that might be harder to talk about, but I think you're right.
I don't need to talk about those.
Right.
Because I can talk about my money.
The hard costs are high enough.
Why is my money going to underwrite ExxonMobil? Why is your tax money? It's the second most heavily capitalized company on the planet after Apple. Those guys don't need any of my money. I also think we need to be talking about, if you look at what I think was Lakoff's very brilliant original breakdown of the nurturing mother versus the strong father paradigm in progressive and conservative politics, we should be framing our arguments in ways that disrupt their ways of thinking, disrupt their frame. So, for example, accountability is rarely discussed in progressive circles. It's heavily discussed in conservative circles. Let's have an accountability conversation. I really do think that we should be having a conversation now. It would be an academic one, but it would be highly useful. What is the punishment that we should administer in future decades to those who are committing crimes against future generations now? There are people who are knowingly committing crimes against future generations now, and we need to have a conversation about the accountability that we will bring to them. So for me, I think I'm quite serious. I think Rex Tillerson, I think we ought to be having a discussion about what's the law that requires Rex Tillerson and his whole family, those who will benefit from some remarkable amount of money he's made off of making global climate change worse and funding global climate denial and front groups and propaganda. What's the accountability? No. We're going to impose a 95% tax on your inheritance, and you are going to have to live your life on the lowest islands in the Maldive chain. And there you will be with no boat to get off. Enjoy. Right? I actually think we should have a conversation about that because, dude, you are endangering my kids and my kids' kids. In fact, you're making the future quite bleak, and you're doing it knowingly. Like, you're an educated person. I'm not talking about a guy who works on an oil derrick out in the Gulf of Mexico. I got no beef with him. That's, he's just getting a job. But
it's the captains.
Hell yeah. And it's the lobbyists, it's the influence peddlers, it's people, it's my peers. I have friends of mine that were working for progressive Democrats in the Senate, and they've all left, and they've all gone, and many of them have left, and they've gone into influence peddling jobs. And you can just see over the years, you kind of see them once in a while, and you see them over the years, and the rationale for doing what they're doing is predictable, and it evolves, and it sounds a lot like excuses that people make for other forms of bad behavior.
So, yeah, let's talk a little bit about coming back to the field of communications. And, a lot of folks I talk to on this podcast have hard policy jobs or are running companies, specific technologies in clean tech. And a lot of those jobs kind of require that people, are either engineers or scientists or trained policy folks. Communications is a little bit different. I mean, to me, it kind of it warms the heart because it opens up possibilities for people who have English backgrounds or humanities backgrounds like myself.
Or who sucked at math like I did.
Likewise. Yeah. So what, we talked a little bit before about kind of the nature of the workforce and what you're seeing. What is your advice generally to people who are coming to ask you for, either a job or maybe just more generally for advice if they want to work on sustainability writ large? Where do you point them?
So I think we're in an era of delivering value propositions. As job candidates, we're in an era of delivering value proposition as opposed to listing experience.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah, but that's not a reality that's appreciated by most job hunters. So first, one thing I would say to the younger listeners of yours is watch the Simon Sinek discussion about the challenges of millennials in the workforce. It's one of the most downloaded talks around. And essentially he says, I'm going to sound like my dad now, but the participation trophy generation, we've done them a disservice. And it's produced some breathtakingly bad job hunting habits from people because they're not getting trained. So I've had people literally turn jobs down or cancel interviews by texting me instead of calling. I've had to go from tossing out any candidacy where the candidate is communicating with typos in it to just hoping I get the fewest number of typos in their stuff. I have people who don't wear socks to interviews. We have people who don't dress up for them. It's a remarkable amount of self-centered job hunting behavior. And as an employer, what I've learned is you get a very limited look into how somebody's going to perform for you, unless you're going to do sophisticated HR personality tests. The job interview process provides a very limited look. So all you have are little things,
right,
mostly.
These clues.
Yeah, and so shame on me as an employer if I'm not paying attention to little things. So I watch, how does somebody keep their small promises? How does somebody honor my time? How does somebody deliver their value proposition to me? Because I'm in the value proposition delivery business. And I don't need them to be perfect, but I need them to be committed. And I need them to be coachable. And we have a particular culture at the firm that emphasizes some of these things. But
how do you identify somebody who's coachable?
I'll give them a gentle piece of feedback on a shortcoming in the presentation and see how they do with it. How do they respond? Are they litigating it with me? Or are they accepting it and thanking me? And can they move on from it?
So I want to end by getting your kind of macro view and kind of coming back to global climate disruption and our future. The news isn't good.
It's terrible.
The scientific consensus is dire. What do you think we need to do to get out of this? And I know it's not a single thing, but if you can sort of name one sort of top of the pyramid priority.
What do we do as communicators, or what do we do as a society?
I'm going to leave it open to you.
If you're working on these issues, I think perhaps the most important thing is adapt a one step at a time approach. I mean, I remember raging at Bush for 8 years. I despised George Bush. I just despised him personally. Like the proud stupidity that he had, the whole sort of fake swagger, Texas swagger thing just drove me crazy. And I remember I was unable to drive past the White House or walk past it without cursing at him. And it was like a tremendous amount of personal time and energy. And I remember when on election night in 2016, like 11:30, I called a friend of mine, Mike Henry, who's Tim Kaine's chief of staff, and I said, "Dude, you going to make up 245,000 votes out of Broward County, Florida?" And he goes, "Tough." So I took an Ambien and a big glass of red wine. I went up to bed. I sat up bolt upright at 5:10 the next morning, and I crept downstairs and I cracked the laptop and the Huffington Post. All I do is just looking at it. It's like Trump won. And I just closed the laptop. I remember looking at the clock. It was 5:10, and I said, Trump is an invitation for intense detachment. We must put one foot in front of the other, because if you pay attention to what we're losing, the problem with sustainability work is it's like taking the blue pill in the Matrix. Once you take it, you can't unknow. you will never uncontaminate the aquifers that we have contaminated through fracking. We are unlikely to unextinct species. We're unlikely to get rid of cheatgrass throughout the West or invasive Japanese stilt grass in the woods behind my home. We are not going to pull out the microplastic from the ocean. And we're not going to get the micropollutants out of your kid's bloodstream. Every child born in this world now, Yanomami Indians, Inuits, and everybody in between, are born into this world pre-polluted because we have played Russian roulette with our chemical loading. So the losses are tragic, and you can spend a lifetime shortening your lifetime by driving yourself crazy. We must look at what's doable right now, whether it's and we shouldn't give a shit whether it's comfortable or not. Discomfort is part of the job, so just embrace it and get over it.
Mike Casey, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks.
The Sustainability Leaders Podcast is a resource of Jobs with Impact. Our engineer and associate producer is Ian Swanky. Theme music also by Ian Swanky. I'm David Rosenheim. If you like the show, please tell your friends and give us a rating and review on iTunes. See you next episode.